get this show on the road. All right. All right. Thank you everyone for coming out. And I really appreciate it. Hope all is well and everyone is in good spirits. So as people continue to pour in, we'll go over some quick housekeeping rules as always. So first, we're asking all attendees to remain on mute throughout the panel discussion. However, would love your input and would love your insights around the discussion. So please feel free to engage and share your thoughts in the chat. I want to also mention, as you could probably notice, that this session will be recorded to be put on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion YouTube page. And the recording is indicated on your top left corner. My name is Kyle. I use he, him pronouns, and I serve as Director of Culture and Community Engagement here at the district's DEI office. I had the pleasure of moderating this conversation today. With that, I want to also welcome you all to the Equity in Practice series. And for those who aren't familiar, and maybe this is your first time, the Equity in Practice series is a collection of community learning opportunities hosted by the School District of Philadelphia's Office of DEI in collaboration with district staff, community advocates, and community-based organizations that are focused on equity, cultural awareness, and social justice. So this month, we will be highlighting the LGBTQIA plus History Month and the LGBTQI community. So this is an amazing opportunity to celebrate and also learn about the community and its history and the roles that members of the LGBTQIA plus community have played in various social justice movements over time. So this conversation will explore this while also creating discussion on how this history can be shared in and out of the classroom. It's also our hope that we can walk away with a few resources and extra information we can share with our communities. So with that, I will jump right in and introduce our panelists. So first, we always want to start with our guests, and we want to welcome Nelson Torres Gomez. Nelson uses he, they pronouns and is an operations manager who was born in Puerto Rico, but was raised in the city of Philadelphia. Nelson is Gale's current senior with over 4 years of serving queer, trans, and BIPOC communities since January 2020. They started at Gale just at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 as an HIV tester, which quickly transitioned into prevention specialist. A prevention specialist. And there, Nelson moved on to become a prevention and education coordinator. They continue to apply themselves and made it to the lead coordinator. And after 2 years, Nelson finally made it into their operations manager position. Thank you so much for joining us, Nelson. We really appreciate it. Next, we will go on to and introduce Angelique Gravely, also known as Angel. I'll be referring to her as Angel throughout the conversation. Angel is a school counselor in the School District of Philadelphia and an LGBTQ plus educator and advocate. For over a decade, she has championed LGBTQ inclusion and affirmation through gap-bridging education and resources that center the experiences of those who have multiple marginalized and visualized in our society. Her multifaceted work has included presenting at national and regional conferences, empowering LGBTQ plus student groups, writing for nationally recognized LGBTQ plus publications, and facilitating LGBTQ plus focused professional development for educators. She holds a Master's of Education in Counselor Education and Human Sexuality Studies from Widener University and a BA from Eastern University, where she gained her passion for this work. Thank you so much for joining us, Angel. Really appreciate it. We also have Nick Bungard. Nick uses he, they pronouns and is a professional learning specialist with 20 years of experience in education. Nick previously served as Director of Student Life and Dean of Students, developing inclusive, cultural responsive school communities. Currently, Nick manages several large-scale professional development programs for SDP educators. This includes Tune Up Tuesday and the Education Symposium. Nick also serves on the working group that provides events, workshops, and supports the LGBTQIA2+ students and staff. Thank you for joining, Nick. So glad to have you here. And finally, we have Lumen Logo Roman. Lumen uses Z's their pronouns, and Lumen works in the Office of Early Childhood Education at the School District of Philadelphia. Z is an advocate for queer and trans rights in everything they do, in and outside of the district. Z also organizes and hosts the Trans Remembrance Coffee House and open mic at the district. And this year, the event will be November 20th from 4 to 6. So please save that on your calendars. Lumen is an avid nerd, writer, and poet who finds their self playing Dungeons and Dragons, starting a queer publishing house, and sewing cosplays in their free time. Thank you so much for joining us, Lumen. All right, let's get started into our conversation. So I got a question for the entire group, and I think we can start with Nelson. So please briefly name one historical figure in the LGBTQ history that has influenced you as a professional, as an advocate, and or as a person.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone finds themselves doing great on this lovely Wednesday. So one historical figure that has influenced me in my professional career as well as an activist is Gloria Caceres. For as long as I can remember, her name and her impact has been undeniable because not only was she an American civil rights activist, an LGBT activist in Philadelphia, but while working at Galay, I was able to get educated on exactly everything that she did, as well as that she was one of Galay's executive directors from 1999 to 2008. She served as Philadelphia's first director of Office of LGBT Affairs. Until this day, her work and legacy still continues to inspire all activists, including myself. And I genuinely just hope to one day have even a quarter, even a drop of the impact that Gloria has had, because if you live in Philadelphia, you don't not know Gloria. Her work, the things that she's done for our community has been genuinely undeniable, and that is someone that I hope to one day reach that level of impact and activism.
Thank you for that, Nelson. And I'm so sorry. Before we move on to the next panelist, I want to give a introduction to Kelly. Kelly, you want to come off mute and share a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sorry, Kyle. I am assistant principal over at Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia, and I did my master's work over at Penn and became a school leader. I was a teacher for 20 years, and happy to be here. Thanks, guys.
Nice. Thank you for joining us, Kelly. So I guess it makes sense to come to you for this question as well. So please briefly name one historical figure in the LGBTQ history that has influenced you as a professional, as an advocate, and or person.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of cheat on this one and not just pick one. I actually, being an educator for as long as I was a literature teacher, and I feel like as a queer youth and adult, the works of Audre Lorde, Emily Dickinson, James Baldwin, Allen Ginsberg, kind of all the whole canon really just influenced me really greatly. Even when I was in spaces where it wasn't acknowledged that they were coming with a queer lens, I always just connected to it. Whether I fully acknowledge my own identity in it or not, I just felt that the truth that they expressed through their experience and their identity deeply connected to my core, and I think made me feel more comfortable as an educator and just as a human being entering into the world in a safe and secure way.
Nice, thank you for that. Let's move on. Lumen, do you have any thoughts?
Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here at the panel today. I'm very similar to Ooh, I forgot friend Kelly. I was coming up and figuring out my transition as I was reading through Audre Lorde and James Baldwin and C.A. Conrad specifically. So these
Roman, I'm
writers
having a
really,
little trouble hearing you.
oh, you're good. Is that better? Is that better? Cool.
Yep, better.
So these writers cradled me throughout my transition as a youth, but these days I'm really focusing in on Sylvia Rivera. She's a Puerto Rican and Venezuelan activist who fought for queer rights in New York City. She worked alongside Marsha P. Johnson, and she started the Star and Transy House. And I've just been really studying her deeply. So if you ever want to get into a really good deep dive, definitely study Sylvia Rivera.
Thank you for that, Lumen. Andrew, do you have any thoughts?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So one person that came to mind for me who's been really influential is Lani Ka'ahumanu, who is a multiracial, feminist, bisexual activist who has been involved in lots of activism since the 60s. And she helped start some of the earliest bisexual plus organizations in the country. She did sexuality education at the beginnings of the AIDS crisis. She's done a lot in the feminist movement. And for me, some of the biggest things that I've learned from Lani are when other people are not willing to give you the supports you need or the resources you need, you create them yourself. You do not need the permission from other people to create the resources that you need. And also the importance of really sharing for those who come after you. Lani is still alive. She's in her 80s. I think she just turned 88. It was her birthday recently. And we've never met in person, but we've communicated virtually. And she is one of the most giving, kindest people that I have ever met. If anybody ever has a question about bisexual plus history, the movement, activism, she's like, oh, let me help you. Let me connect you to somebody else. And that is the type of person that I aspire to be for those coming up after me.
Nice. I love that. What about you, Nick?
I am influenced on this day, and I'm evoking Hulea Sinajane, she, her, who's a indigenous artist, photographer, museum director, and professor at UC Davis. And why Hulea stands out to me is because she started as a painter and then switched over to photography because she wanted to center on the culture and the history and the experience of Native people for Native people. And check out this quote that I pulled that she had, this just fire that I would like to share with everybody. I'm just going to read it. This is from Hulea. The photographs I take are not for white people to look at Native people. I take photographs so Native people can look at Native people. I make photographs for Native people, and they're beautiful artwork. They use color and they use shapes to influence the positions that the people in the photographs are in. And Hulea just stands out to me as someone who is extraordinary in their advocacy and really is that intersectional approach. She identifies as lesbian, but then also is disrupting and dismantling colonism by using photography as her form of, what do I want to say, as her weapon to dismantle white supremacy. I'm going to drop a link to Hulea's photography if you would like to look at that later.
Nice. Thank you so much for that, Nick. Really appreciate it. For this next question, I want to go straight to Angel. So Angel, how do you believe the history of the LGBTQ plus movement has shaped the current social landscape?
So I think a couple things come up for me in terms of the current social landscape. I think that the fight that LGBTQ plus advocates and activists have done over the last several decades have made it so that modern day LGBTQ plus advocates can really lean on that political action when they're trying to figure out how to respond to what's going on in our times. I feel like, especially over the past several years, and I don't know if it's just, so I moved to Philly about 11 years ago, which coincided with my becoming more out. So I don't know if it's that or if it's just the times, but I definitely feel like there is more referencing to Stonewall and to thinking back at like, this was a really extraordinary moment that shifted the LGBTQ plus movement, and what can we learn from that as we're moving forward. I think another thing that stands out to me is that because of the work that activists and advocates and organizations have done over the years, there are some things that happened in the past that I feel like, even as things get trying and bad, that younger generations don't necessarily, they can't fathom that those things happen, which is a positive in the sense of they're not experiencing these things. But I think it's good that they're not experiencing them, but then if they're also not learning that this happened, sometimes it makes them feel, or us feel like, this is as bad as it's ever been. It's just, there's no going forward. But if we know that, no, there was a time when, you know, you could get electroshock therapy for being queer. And it was really like, if you haven't seen videos or anything like that, it's hard to describe how awful that experience was. And advocates, even advocates from Philly, were instrumental in fighting that and getting that changed so that that wouldn't be a thing. I feel like that piece is sometimes missing because we're like, there was a period of time where we weren't super talking about LGBTQ plus issues. And now that we're talking about them more, I feel like we're not always talking about the history. So there's not that connection between like, we are not experiencing some of the horrible things that happened in the past. And there's a reason behind that because of the work that our activists have done. And we can lean on them just like we lean on what we know from Stonewall to keep moving things forward and creating more affirming society and just society for all of us.
Nice, I appreciate that. Nelson, do you have any thoughts on that question?
So I mean, just to piggyback off of what you know, Angel said, so like I hate to sound cliche, but it's kind of like, you know, the history of the LGBTQ movement allowed us to make progress, but there's still a lot of more work that needs to be done. Obviously, the state of the current social landscape is very different now from when I was growing up, as we have like evolved tremendously. Even in regards to just within the community itself. I mean, I remember growing, like when I grew up, there was no safe spaces, there was no laws or anything to protect individuals such as myself. And even in regards to stuff like gender identity, when I was first coming out, when I was in like 6th grade, there was no such thing as like non-binary. There was a lot of like factors that, even the fact that something that we had to fight to get equal right, like the same equal rights as our like heterosexual counterparts, was very difficult. I mean, we barely got gay same-sex marriage legalized, and I say barely because even in that sense, it was still like 5-4 in regards to the Supreme Court ruling. So I feel like what so the like the fight that was done before, it's what got the ball rolling, but it's in today, like in 2024, like the work that we do is what allows us to keep that ball in motion. It's because our rights are constantly being threatened. It's 2024 and it's still like, you know, all of these new laws that they're trying to put into place to attack individuals such as ourselves, such as trans individuals, non-binary individuals. It's still one of those things that, yeah, we have a lot more, we have a lot of a bigger voice now, but it's still like our voice is still trying to be silenced. And it's still one of those things that we still need to constantly be on the front lines fighting just to keep what something that we shouldn't have to fight for. I don't feel like it's like, you know, we're all human. I don't feel like it's one of those things that I should wake up tomorrow and feel like, oh, I might lose my rights to do anything from one day to another because the people in power feel like it's more important to take our rights away than actual contemporary issues or problems that are actually going on now.
I appreciate that. All great points. Thank you both for that. I'm going to move on to our next question, which is, and I want to direct this to Nick. How does the intersection of LGBTQ plus history and other social justice movements, such as civil rights, women's rights, how does it enrich our understanding of both movements?
Okay, intersectionality. I'm not going to get this all the way right because I can't speak about everyone and everything, but I'm on a panel, so I'm going to share my perspective. Sound good, everybody?
Absolutely.
Okay. Racism, transphobia, homophobia, misogyny, and religious persecution hurts everybody, period. Intersectionality involves us moving past ourselves and what we got going on and doing the work to seek out and center the voices, the perspectives, and the concerns of our most marginalized. And that's fluid, right? It's going to be a certain group in certain situations, and a certain group in other. But here's the goop. All of us hold multiple identities. We're not just one thing, right? And some of those identities hold privilege and some do not. And so taking inventory of that for yourself is a great place to start. But how then do you move from self onto others? How are you looking and listening to what's happening? Only then can we begin to find authentic ways to disrupt and dismantle the dominant culture's foothold of oppression. I'm gonna leave it at that, drop the mic on that, and I'm gonna leave you with a quote from James Baldwin, which I think is really important to speaking to how justice is administered in this country. So that's my take.
No, I appreciate that, Nick. Angel, do you have any thoughts on that question as well?
Yeah, just backing up what Nick said, what always comes to mind is Audre Lorde's quote, there's no single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And one of the things that history shows us that I don't think we always talk about is how successes in movements for justice, for change, are usually building off of each other. A really great anthology that I think helps show this is called Black Like Us, which is a collection of fiction from Black, lesbian, gay, and bisexual writers from going back, I think it spans 100 years. And one of the things that they do in the introduction to each year span in that book is they talk about the movement, the political action that is kind of shaping the works that these writers are creating. And they talk a lot about how you look at what was happening in women's rights movements and what was happening in Black civil rights movements and the people who were at the intersections of those movements and how they were leading some of that work, or how sometimes you see LGBTQ plus rights movements that, oh, we're trying to figure out a political action. Let's look and see what was going on in the Black civil rights movement and take from some of that action. And I think that that really shows that we have to lean on each other in order to get all of us free. And if we are trying to create a safer, more just world for LGBTQ plus people, and specifically, since we're in the district thinking about our LGBTQ plus students, like if we're not thinking about the intersections that are happening, then we are not getting everybody free.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate that. I want to take our next question to both Lumen and Kelly, but I'll start with Lumen. How have cultural shifts in perception of LGBTQ plus identities impacted the way LGBTQ plus history is taught and perceived in schools?
I appreciate this question. As a writer, I immediately go and start considering the trends that's happening in the country of banning books and curriculum. that's centered around queer narratives. In my opinion, if we stifle and silence queer history in schools and in history classes, we're teaching the future generations that being queer is inherently bad, that it's something to be ashamed of, that it's something that we need to hide. And haven't we done enough hiding and enduring the shame for being this bright, this brilliant? Why mustn't we teach our future generations that that's something to be ashamed of?
Thank you, Lumen. Kelly, you have thoughts?
Yes, yeah, so many thoughts. I mean, what do we see happening in our world right now is that we see a lot of, to the point where we're seeing books banned all over our country. Right here in Bucks County, I mean, we're seeing people who are actively spending their time and energy and their life working to silence the narrative that they're so afraid of. And I think that as we move within this space, it is just that much more important that we are pushing it to the forefront. But I do feel like, it's one step forward, three steps back. It feels like that sometimes, where we're constantly pushing. I think it's so important to make sure that we are pushing GSAs in school, that we are creating more and more space for our queer youth to be able to be seen and heard, and just feel valued, because I do think that the world that we're currently living in, as much progress that has taken place, I think unfortunately we're seeing that there are people who are making it their jobs in our world right now to push against that. And so I think in these shifts that we see, making sure that not only, I think I brought up when I was talking about the people who influenced me, I think, a lot of times that was despite the fact that no one brought up that they identified as queer. And I think that in that reality, I had to kind of come to that on my own. And that feeling of invisibility, or why didn't they mention this part of one's identity, was really powerful to me as a teacher of 20 years, and being someone who I know didn't always push representation and didn't always bring those things up. And when I did, was often, in parent meetings about why that was not acceptable, or why that was wrong of me to bring up Allen Ginsberg in a book of, in a class full of lessons on poetry. Why was his voice not worth hearing in that space? And even a similar space in Connecticut, where AP teachers were fired for teaching queer literature. I think that there's and we don't just see that when we talk about intersectionality. We don't see that in our district just in the space of queer, those with just in a queer space. We see that everywhere, and teachers being removed from classrooms and things of that nature for political and or religious views. So I think it is, it's never a time to become idle when it comes for fighting for the rights of ourselves and for our students. Because at the end of the day, and I would love to talk about this all day long, but at the end of the day, like, it is our job as educators, as school leaders, to protect the safety of our staff and our students. And that is not going to happen if the rhetoric continues to ramp up and people aren't seen for who they are and the beauty of that.
Thank you so much for that, Kelly. Really appreciate it. One word I heard you mention too is representation. So I think it's a good segue to our next question. So I want to direct this to Nelson, if I may. What can the history of LGBTQ exclusion and marginalization teach us about the importance of visibility and representation today?
So in the history of LGBTQ exclusion and marginalization, it's always, for as long as I can remember, it was always just, it led to us being the target of hate crimes. I mean, there was variety of cases where people, and even now it happens, maybe not as frequent, but it's still very much like we're still the target of hate crimes. Back in the day, representation when it came to LGBTQ members we were always the butt of the joke, whether it was in media, we were never protected. I remember constantly just reading about us being murdered, about cops not wanting to get involved because it was uncomfortable for them because it had to do with gay individuals. And I believe that the representation and the visibility matters, because without that, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it has led to like more anxiety, depression, and everything because of the bullying, the hate crimes, because the media portraying that being queer, being gay, being lesbian, trans was bad, that it was unnormal, the way that it was presented. So I believe that the way the visibility has changed and the way that it's being presented now has made a great shift as to how folks and individuals do see us, about how things have changed. And I think representation and visibility for LGBTQ plus individuals can help tackle the mental health issues faced by the community, because it's different when you see a gay man, a lesbian being portrayed as the butt of the joke, like, oh, he's gay, so he has to be super flamboyant. Like, even the other day I was watching Legally Blonde, and it was the gay characters were always a butt of a joke. Where versus now I feel like it's being represented maybe like in a more accurate depiction, where it's like folks LGBTQ plus individuals are getting more limelight, where it's in a better manner, and it's like we're no longer being portrayed as the butt of the joke. We're still experiencing hate crime because that has not stopped, but it's just like now I feel like it's probably prioritized a little more than it was before, not completely, because obviously cases like Matthew Shepard are still seen even today. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that we see about an average up until now, if I'm not mistaken, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I feel, if I do remember correctly, there's been about 20 trans individuals that have been murdered in this year alone. That's an average of 2 to 3 trans individuals per month, which is insane to think about. So I believe that, I believe that that's why it's important for the visibility and the representation to be, 24 individuals have been killed so far. So an average of like 2 to 3 a month. So I think that's why it's important for visibility and representation.
Thank you so much, Nelson. Really appreciate that. Lumen, do you have any thoughts on that particular question as well?
Yeah, I do. I'm going to be very intense as I talk about this. I hope that's okay. Our queer and trans ancestors and elders have fought tooth and nail for queer rights to be at the front of our consciousness and history. I've myself lost friends to the effect of hate crimes and stigmatizing view of queer people that society's put on us. Look at our history. Things like Stonewall, the AIDS epidemic, and now the attacks on trans bodies in healthcare just shows us how little our society cares about our lives. Being queer is inherently an active rebellion against our current culture, so being as loud and unabashedly queer as possible is a major way to normalize and get our cis heteronormative society to see us. They'll see our beauty, but they won't see us at all if we're not out there. Our queer kids deserve to grow up, so we queer adults owe them our visibility to pave an easier path for them and their future.
Thank you so much for that, Lumen. Let's go into our next question. And I'll direct this to Angel. How can understanding the evolution of LGBTQ rights and acceptance over time help us better support LGBTQ students in their personal and academic growth?
So I think one thing is just, we have to understand that all these things that are happening are impacting our LGBTQ plus students. Even if they're not talking to us about them, they see the news, they hear the reports, they hear about the hate crimes, and that is living in their spirits, which is impacting their personal and academic development. I think with that in mind, one of the ways that understanding the history can help is by being able to provide the history to students so that they know that they stand on the shoulders of all of these beautiful workers for change, and that they, even when it looks like there's no way out of the current state that the world is in, we know from history that that's not true, that there have been horrible states and LGBTQ plus leaders have fought and have made changes. And sometimes it has taken a lot of time, but knowing that it's not hopeless, like I have found, like as a school counselor, I've had some students talk to me about like, well, what happens if the election goes a certain way? What happens if a law gets passed here that's going to impact me as a trans student? And so we've had conversations about that, but we've also had conversations about like, this is the history of LGBTQ plus activism in our city and in our state and throughout the country, so that students are like, oh, there are resources out there. I think a lot of times our students don't know what the history is. They don't know how full of LGBTQ plus activism Philly is. And so it's just like I'm in my box of school and home and whatever I do outside of home, and I don't really know what's going on. And I'm hearing all these negative things from TV, or I'm seeing weird things online where I don't know where people are falling. And so to really ground them in what the reality is of the history and how there have been changes, I've seen it help students find hope in situations that made them feel hopeless.
Thank you so much for that, Angel. Really appreciate it. I want to start on this next question with Kelly. So Kelly, what lessons from LGBTQ history can we apply to create a more inclusive and supportive environment for not only LGBTQ students, but staff as well?
Yeah, so I actually would really specifically like to target this to speaking to school leaders and teachers specifically, just because I feel like, and we've talked a lot about representation, but the reality is that we serve students every single day. We serve staff every single day that identify, and I think the reality is that students and staff need to see themselves in their unique identities and feel valued and loved in those spaces. Staff needs to feel protected and safe when exploring literature and history that has been influenced by figures who worked out of a space of queerness. When we fail to do this, what we see and what we tell students is that they should remain silent, that our staff should remain silent, and continue the oppressed state in their place of learning, and by extension, the world that they live in. The lesson that gets taught is the best way to experience, the lesson that then gets taught to our students and our staff is the best way to experience the world, is to basically just keeping themselves apart, quiet, that they should conform to societal norms that do not include them or recognize the value of they bring to everything that they do through the aspects of their identity. I can speak from personal experience of being in a school for many years, and we had a teacher come in. We had a handful of folks that did identify, and many more students that identified within our school culture and space and community, but did not, nobody was terribly vocal about it. And we had somebody begin on staff who was, and it was really amazing. Within a year, everybody was fully out in our community, and it vibrated throughout our building, to the point where we then had students coming to us and kind of just sharing their personal experiences and identity as well, in a really beautiful and symbiotic way. So I've seen this happen where that representation really does just add vibrancy to a community and value to a community that otherwise is stifled and stunted. And I think if history teaches us anything in the school district of Philadelphia, is that we don't need to be scared of neutral gender bathrooms. We don't have to be scared of giving the kids too much visibility. People are who they are. We don't make them who they are. They are those people. And I think that that's really essential. I mean, obviously I could sit here and talk about professional development and helping those to see ways in which we can reach out to one another. Resources, texts that tell a diverse narrative are essential, because as I think it was said before by Nick, I do not represent every queer woman. None of us stand alone as being like, I'm the proprietor of knowledge in any particular category of identity. But I do think that this has been said before, but I'll repeat it. It is that if we aren't representing our own personal identity and being proud of that and expressing that, especially with our students, that we will then be communicating something to them that I think unfortunately will lead to, I think Lumen said this, but will lead to potentially losing our students. And I don't think there's anybody who's listening to this or anybody who is definitely on this call that would say that in any world, I would absolutely pick visibility over the loss of any of our students. And I think most educators believe that, whether that is communicated through practice or not.
Thank you so much for that, Kelly. Really appreciate it. Nick, do you have any thoughts for that question as well?
Wow, I've always got something. So, two parts to this question: LGBTQ history and how that applies to supportive environments today. Stay with me, everybody. I'm going to build off of where Nelson started. Hi, Nelson. In that we don't have to go back very far in history to see where the LGBTQ community is being targeted. Let's talk about legislation, for example, that has been passed recently in recent memory. Book bans, don't say gay, decreasing access to gender affirming care. This stuff is happening now. So it is important for us to raise issues, to talk about issues that's concerning many different communities, but we're here today to talk about the LGBT community. And so how are we naming that our community is under attack, for lack of a better word, and being intimidated, and also slowly and quietly being erased? So with that, I'm going to lead into how do we as educators create more supportive environments for children who are existing in a world that they're trying to be erased. So we are fortunate to live in Philadelphia, and as long as we're within the city limits of Philadelphia, there are certain protections that are granted to LGBTQ folks. So that's important to know where you are. If you step out of the city limits, that all changes. So how do our students know of these things? That's part of our job, to create a supportive environment for them. The district in 2016 passed Policy 252, Board Policy 252, that supports and centers on our transgender and gender expansive children. It is not illegal or a crime to center on our most marginalized, regardless of what a parent might say, or regardless of what society may say is appropriate, age appropriate. We're always age appropriate when we talk about supporting our students. However, that gets twisted real easily, right? Talking about who we love in kindergarten is different than a conversation that we would have with a student that's in high school, all right? We always keep it age appropriate in the school district of Philadelphia. However, if we lead in fear in our classrooms, I don't want to have this conversation because I'm afraid, then we are doing a disservice to our children. Policy 252 protects adults as well who stand up and center for transgender and gender expansive students. You will have the full support of the school district of Philadelphia if you are centering on the needs, wants, interests, and rights of our transgender and gender expansive students. So I'm going to drop in the chat before I'm done, policy 252 in the reference guide. If you don't know, now you know. And to soften this as we end up, because I got on my soapbox a little bit. We as educators on a softer side can also infuse what I like to call everyday inclusion into our classrooms and our lessons. It's not something drastic. It's nothing extreme. We're not indoctrinating anybody. It's simple little gestures. Things like giving students access to different ways of thinking and being and existing so that they can make up their own mind what's right for them. If we're only providing one side of the story, we're limiting access to what's all the different types of identities and ways of being there are in our world. Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop says about books and education that they're like mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. We as educators, for all of our students and for all identities, with everyday inclusion, need to provide opportunities where students can see themselves in our classrooms and in their curriculum. Our students also deserve the opportunity to have windows in which to see other ways of being, thinking, and doing in this world. And lastly, we can create supportive spaces where we provide sliding glass doors for students to step into someone else's shoes, to empathize for someone else's experience. The word of the day is empathy.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. Really appreciate it. A lot of good stuff there. So we will have 13 minutes left. So I'm gonna be very specific with some of our last few questions, just to give you a heads up with our last 13 minutes. So I want to direct the next question to Lumen. How can we ensure that the LGBTQ history is not just a one-time lesson, but also is integrated to foster a more empathetic environment in both schools and our community at large?
Thank you for asking. I think that we as administrators and educators need to build our history, specifically LGBTQ, but also all other marginalized identities at large, into our curriculum. We need to put them, acceptance, and as Nick said, empathy and equity into our policies. We need to create GSA centers in every school, which are gender and sexual alliances. We need to throw queer prompts. We need to hold the student bodies and teachers responsible for one another's bigotry. We need to take confident and unified stands for the future of our queer children. When we build these spaces, we can foster positive conversations about queer issues between teachers, between students, between everyone. We need to create spaces for children to thrive, for students to thrive and teach each other. Just like Nick said, it's about everyday inclusion.
Thank you so much, Lumen. Really appreciate that. So for my next question, what resources or materials would you recommend to effectively teaching LGBTQ history in schools, but also resources for the community at large, for students to take home and for students to kind of learn outside of school as well? So I'll start with Nelson, but I'll make my way around to the entire group for this question. But let's start with Nelson.
I'm sorry, I was writing something in the chat. What was the question?
No worries, no worry. What resources or materials would you recommend to effectively teach LGBTQ history in schools? And if there's not resources in mind for teaching in schools, what resources do you have or do you know of for learning more about LGBTQ plus history outside of schools?
So to piggyback off of, because that's actually what I was trying to drop in the chat. So to piggyback off of Nick, our Teens program manager, Hazel, she actually helped develop policy 252. So it was there. I believe that is one of the best places to start. I mean, I was going to drop a shorthand version of the full policy that can be utilized for youth, the school district, outreach events. I think that is, considering that it was made in buildings, so I have a very soft spot for it. I think that would be one of the great things to be taught. I think LGBTQ history, as well as, because when it comes to any other form of history, whether it's American history, schools don't hold back. I remember learning about wars, learning about people getting shot. So it's obviously, I think that when it comes to LGBTQ plus history, I think starting with trans trans history itself would be a great place to start, because some of the biggest movements and some of the biggest impacts have made by trans identifying individuals. That's just fact. So that's where I would go.
Appreciate that, Nelson. Let's go to you, Angel. You have any thoughts?
Yes, so I love resources. I love LGBTQ plus history and finding LGBTQ plus history resources. Again, I think that book that I mentioned, that anthology, Black Like Us, is really good, especially if you're teaching literature, because you can pick and choose from different, you can add it into different spaces depending on what you're teaching, and have it all be connected. Something that a lot of young people don't know that we have in Philly is at the William Way LGBTQ Community Center, there's an archive there, and they are open to having guests come by, to scheduling appointments, which is a place to learn more about Philly's LGBTQ plus history. So that's another resource to think about. Some websites that I really recommend are Outwards, which does video recordings of LGBTQ plus elders telling their stories. There's Out History is another website that has a lot of LGBTQ plus resources, but those are just some that come to mind immediately that I know are some places to start getting some of that information. I believe the National Black Justice Coalition also has some Black LGBTQ plus same gender loving history resources connected through one of the projects that they took under their umbrella. And Listen, which I used to be a member of Listen Philly, they have LGBTQ plus history cards and are updating them currently. So the new batch is supposed to be coming out soon. I just got an email, I think last week, to sign up to get the blast once the update is there. So those are all resources that lots of people can use in different ways to try and connect students to LGBTQ plus history.
Nice. Thank you so much. Lumen, I saw you dropping a few links in the chat. So what are your thoughts?
The link that I added to the chat was the Black Like Us anthology. I just wanted to, for everyone, I know it's through Amazon. I don't like Jeffrey Bezos, but that was the link I found the quickest. But for me personally, I think that some great community resources are right here in the city. There's Big Brothers Big Sisters, there's Mazzoni, Glisten, Galilei. There are some beautiful things happening at the school district. I'm sure Nick will speak to it, but there's also some great equity series that's happening through the DEI office that I've even signed up for myself. I think that we need to hire more queer teachers and protect and support them at the district. I think that they are a great anthology and resource for our students. So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Lumen. I'm going to go to you, Kelly. Do you have any resources on top of mind?
Yeah, I have some commentary first, but I do think that, I mean, the school district has been working with equity groups and affinity groups. I think getting more support from, I hear a lot of school leaders like, oh, this is, you know, like, I really would rather be in my school building working on these things. Like, there's not a lot of like narrative of support around that. And I know that it's a constant fight to keep that going. So I think making sure that that's at the forefront. I think affinity groups, schools running affinity groups, book clubs, family nights to celebrate and educate culture and climate and different identities in the community. I think developing more inclusive curriculum. I think getting more voices on who's developing that curriculum. I think, you know, supportive educators. I think working with educators to realize that we are, you know, like mental health and homelessness and suicide and all the things around our queer youth is significant and needs to be addressed. I think policy 252, I think we've seen from action through professional development that there is a lot of work to be done around what that looks like and how that's to be implemented. I think school leaders that are committed to restorative and productive conversation around when things happen in our schools, which a lot of us work in very diverse spaces. Like, how are we handling that? Are we having the challenging conversations? Are we training our leaders to have those challenging conversations and difficult conversations? I know Nelson supported the fact that GSA should not be a choice in schools. Like, that should be a club. That should be something that's happening and a created affinity space for students. I think all these resources and all of it, solid education around creating allies and not bullies. Yeah, I think that, and I really do, and maybe this is coming as a school leader who's with students every day, all the time, which I know some of you are as well, is that I just they need a space. They need a place to go to.
No, thank you for that, Kelly. No worries. Nick, what are your thoughts?
I just kind of blew up the chat with some things that I kind of broke down by grade band, because it can sometimes be tough to figure out like where to go in your, with the students in the age group that you work with. I'm really proud the LGBT working group curated an LGBT book list, K-12, that offers books that you can get from the free library. And it even offers age-appropriate questions to ask after having students engage with that reading, whether it's a read aloud in kindergarten or it's an independent read for older students. So that creates an access point for those windows to see into other ways of being. K-5, the HRC's Welcoming Schools program provides lessons that K-5 teachers can incorporate into their classrooms that touch on empathy, inclusion, and it isn't just LGBT, it's inclusion of all identities, especially calling mention to our neurodiverse and our physically able-bodied and disable-bodied individuals. So Welcoming Schools. In K-12, check out Policy 252. And never underestimate the power of being humble. If a student gives you the gift of sharing their identity with you, be humble, ask questions, ask them what they want you to do. You can't go wrong that way. And that is my biggest takeaway, I hope, from everybody, is that just listen and ask, what do you need from me? What can I do for you? And students will guide you. And lastly, if you want to continue conversations like this in a learning space, come to Tune Up Tuesday or the Educator Symposium. We have sessions around social justice and liberatory learning, and we'd love to see you there.
Nice. Thank you so much, Nick. And I want to take this time in our last 2 minutes to thank all of our panelists just for sharing your expertise and just taking the time to just have this conversation. We really, really appreciate it. What I will do, if you were unable to make this this discussion, if you know of a colleague that may be interested, these videos will be on the School District of Philadelphia's DEI YouTube page. So if you register today, I'll be sure to follow up with you with the link to the video. So give me a day or so, and we'll be sure to get that link to you. And feel free to share with a colleague. But for now, thank you so much for joining, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you, everyone.